What's up, book fam? My name is Frank Reynolds. Welcome to another episode of Is It Worth It? Where I review books across all genres and let you know which are worth your time. Y'all know the drill by now. We're talking today about books, reviewing one of the latest releases in the science fiction genre, A Desolation Called Peace by Arkady Martine, the sequel to the Hugo-winning memory called Empire, a widely anticipated release, and I want to talk today about whether or not it lives up to the hype, because the first book is outstanding. It's a stellar read, and it doesn't have many flaws. You can go back and check out the review for A Memory Called Empire from a few weeks back before diving into this one. A Desolation Called Peace picks up a couple of months after A Memory Called Empire left off, with Mahit back on her home world, dealing with the fallout from the events of A Memory Called Empire. Same could be said for 3 Seagrass and 19 Ads, and all of our main lovable characters that we grew to love and care about in Book 1. However, Book 2 is structured a bit differently. While A Memory Called Empire focused solely on Mahit as our main protagonist, she is now one of 4 primary point of view characters here, significantly limiting her book time, screen time, however you want to classify it. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes and whether or not it was a good decision. But first, I want to focus on how Arkady Martine was able to get the band back together, because the first book has everybody kind of going their separate ways. And while the main conflict regarding the alien invasion, the pending alien invasion, is very much present and set up for a second novel, the way that these characters are going to interact in a second book is very much unclear. And she's able to get everyone back together on the same page and working as a team in a very seamless way that does not feel forced at all. And that was something that had to be thought out well in advance. It certainly was meant to be done in the sequel rather than decided upon after the release of the first novel, and she does a good job with it. There's nothing forced there. Everything falls into place rather seamlessly, and it then kicks off our adventure in Book 2. Another thing that Martine does extremely well is explain certain concepts specifically related to science fiction that I would have no idea how to tackle if I was an author. There's a specific situation in Book 1, toward the end of the novel, maybe 3/4 of the way through the novel, that it's probably the most impressive, or at least one of the most impressive writing sequences I've ever encountered as a reader. There's a lot of internal dialogue and present action and memory-related cognitive experiences that all come into play and in focus, and had to have been extremely challenging to channel and write about in the novel. Again, no clue how I would have done it as an author. I don't think I would have done it well, and she did it expertly. Well, in A Desolation Called Peace, these are in play again. There are certain situations here that she's able to articulate in a way that helps us follow the events of the story so effortlessly, despite the complications present and the complicated nature of those complications. She's an excellent science fiction writer who's able to tackle some of these outlandish, situational pieces in ways that feel real and true. It's very Michael Crichton-esque how she's able to do this. Gotta touch on something else too, because in my review for A Memory Called Empire, I mentioned how one of my critiques for the book was that the modern themes felt forced. And I said that if she was able to incorporate those themes in the sequel properly, without us feeling like the editors or the publishers made her throw it in, I would retract that statement. Well, I'm here to retract it, because the way that she builds on some of those themes specifically related to the LGBTQ community in Book 2 are incredible, and they're timely, relevant, and they're done in a way that's tasteful. I think that she did a great job, and now looking back, you can clearly see that Memory had certain other bigger situations in play, and she was just setting up the situation from an awareness standpoint so that she wouldn't have to do so in book 2, and rather she could just expand upon it. And man, she does so in a much more visceral and in-your-face sort of way that is incredibly well done. A Desolation Called Peace is a really solid sequel overall. She does a good job of giving us a lot of what we asked for in the first novel, but I gotta go back to what I said about splitting Mahit's time as the point of view narrator with other characters, some of whom are brand new and others are introduced in book 1, maybe even relatively central to the conflict in book 1, and now they are, we're getting in their heads and we're, focusing on them from a narrative perspective. I didn't like the decision. It was a little frustrating to only receive about a quarter of the story from Mahit's perspective that we got in the first book. We've grown to love Mahit so much, and she does have a central purpose from other characters' point of views, but overall I wanted more Mahit because that's the character we've grown to love in the first book. And I don't know how I would have handled this otherwise to tell the full story. Maybe made the book longer and give us some more Mahit. Maybe only focus on 2 or 3 point of view characters rather than 4, so that she can have more book time. But I felt more frustrated and unsatisfied than I felt relieved at having these multiple perspectives to see the world from. I mean, granted, the pacing's fine. She actually does a great job with the pacing with these other characters here. It might even be more well done than in the first book because we have those characters to bounce around from and to give us breaks from on these other characters. But maybe just because the first book was so well done, I was expecting more of the same, and when we got something different, it just felt a bit jarring. And jarring might not even be the best word. Maybe it's like more underwhelming because of what we expect. And speaking of underwhelming, that's what the aliens are. We are building them up to be this great brute force that is going to cause a ton of issues for our protagonist in the second novel, and that's just not the case. They're pretty underwhelming. They kind of reminded me of the aliens in that movie. I also think it's a book, but I've only seen the movie. Arrival. Very underwhelming. It's smartly done. She does everything well. It was just dull. It works from a conflict resolution standpoint, and we actually do get a really cool interaction with them. Actually, some multiple interactions with them that make a lot of sense. Like, she's not forcing these situations on us and these developments on us. It feels like the way things might play out if an alien invasion were to happen, but it's just not up to expectations. It doesn't live up to the hype, and that was disappointing. Overall, and just maybe this is a testament to the first book and just how great it was. I mean, it won a Hugo Award after all. I just wasn't as engrossed in this story. It's a good sequel. The characters go in places we kind of want them to go. We still care about them. And there's some really cool action sequences present. Like I said, the way that Martine is able to work around certain science fiction elements and explain them to us is as great as ever. But the story itself just isn't quite as entertaining here. I wasn't as big of a fan of what Martine was trying to show us in A Desolation Called Peace. It's intelligent, it builds on book 1, but it's just not as good. To me, it just wasn't as good as the first book. Makes me a little nervous for the third novel, especially because there is no clear direction, at least in the way that there was after book 1, for where we're going to go in book 2. Book 2 gives a minor hint in the epilogue, but outside of that, things wrap up pretty well, and I have no clue how we're going to get the band back together in book 3 the way that we did in book 2. But I trust Martine at this point, given her success with the first book and how she was at least able to piece together a solid, if not exemplary sequel. So we'll have to see. Audible Check In time. I'm slowly beginning to love the narrator for this series. She's one of my favorite narrators in the entire Audible space. In the first book, she is Mahit Dzmare. But this book, she had to take on multiple different characters, some even from a male's perspective, And she does so in a way that gives multiple personalities and emotional cognizance. There's a whole bunch of work being done here by the narrator to give us multiple perspectives. She's fantastic. I highly recommend her. Her work with the Imago machines is especially impressive in A Desolation Called Peace when we compare it to the first novel. She's evolved, and I can't wait to see what she does in future stories. So, is A Desolation Called Peace worth it? And really, I guess, is the Teixcalaanli series worth it? Look, obviously A Memory Called Empire is worth it. I gave it a stellar review the first time around with very little negative feedback, and those who finish it will want to read A Desolation Called Peace. Desolation Called Peace is also a decent sequel. It's not outstanding. It hits on a lot of the notes you want it to, but in terms of entertainment value, it's just not quite as good as the first book. And how many sequels are? I mean, in all reality, if we're not talking about the conclusion of an ongoing series, most follow-up sequels are just not as good as the first book. It's a well-paced story with interesting characters. It fulfills some of the promises given in the first book, and it plays on and acts on certain situations that were set up, but like I said, just not as good. Nothing necessarily falls flat. I do want to make that plain, but it's underwhelming overall, and there are some excellent sequences still. I also don't want to make it seem like the whole book is just like this like piece. Like, no, there's some great sequences here, and it's probably why the book scored a 74 on the worthy meter for me. Like, that's still a solid score. That's a worth it score. But compared to the first book, which landed in the 80s, it is significantly less. I think something that I was expecting from this book that the first book fell flat on was an extremely awesome resolution to the conflict, a great climax here. That's one of the issues with the first book that I have, one of the few issues, is that the climax itself felt a bit underwhelming for the situations that are laid out beforehand and the build up to it. It's more of the same here. The build up is pretty intense, and everything just kind of happens at the end. I feel like I'm like talking about this book like it's not that great. No, it's a good book. It's a good follow-up, and this series as a whole, I really recommend it, especially to science fiction fans, and especially the first book. Like, if you read the first book and you're not too into it, Desolation Called Peace isn't for you. But if you really like the first book, which I think most science fiction fans will, give the second book a read because it's still good. But don't expect it to be Hugo-winning A Memory Called Empire good. Just go into it with that knowledge and maybe you'll enjoy it more, because I had really high expectations and they just fell slightly flat. Thanks again for joining me on another episode of Is It Worth It? As you've probably noticed, a lot of my reviews lately have been positive. In fact, I don't really have any, one or two, books that I say aren't worth it. And I think it's different from film in that when you read a book and you invest a lot of time into it and you make it to the end, it was probably worth your time because it takes longer to read a book than it does to see a movie or watch a TV show or whatever the case may be. So next week, I want to talk about some of the novels over the last year that I've gotten into and have not finished because, to me, they were not worth it. I'm talking about the books I haven't finished in the fantasy genre next week on another episode of Is It Worth It? Thanks a lot, guys. Have a good week, and I'll see you back here next week with a slightly different twist on the Is It Worth It platform. Have a good one. Thanks.